Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages. Actually, hopefully not on that one, to an evolved review. We're going to be covering a pretty heavy topic here today. We're going to be covering the first part of the Chris Benoit tragedy. I am James Caleb Kitchens. I have about 15 years combined in the wrestling industry among various roles. I'm joined today by my co host, the man who watches more wrestling than anybody I've ever met. He watches about 26 hours of wrestling a day. Caleb Stoval. Caleb, welcome back.
Thank you for that, and I am damn proud of it.
And we are joined here today by our first guest. You can hear him on Viral Pro Wrestling. You can also hear him on the Superhero Homies podcast. Welcome, Quinten Ace Ficklin, or Superhero Homie Q, as you'll hear him on the Superhero Homies podcast. Ace, welcome to the show.
Thank you, brother. I am really excited to be here. I'm honored to be the first guest. I'm looking forward to the episode.
And my broadcast colleague at VPW.
Absolutely.
Right, I'm the stranger here. You guys are used to doing this all the time. So before we kind of get a little bit more into this, so we are going to be reviewing the two Dark Side of the Ring episodes about the Chris Benoit tragedy. This is probably the darkest content that they have, and this is something that's very close to all of us. So if you haven't seen these two episodes, you'll get a lot more out of this if you go and watch them first and then come back. So you can find those on YouTube. You can find them on Hulu. You can find them on Google Play. They're all over the place. So they're both made by Viceland. And, if you haven't seen those yet, go take a look at them and then come back. That's the topic we're going to be discussing for the next two episodes. We're specifically going to be talking about the first episode here today. That being said, let's cut to our sponsor for this week. Our sponsor for this week's episode is none other than Suplexes and Microphones. These guys have a ton of interviews out there. You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, at Suplexes and Mics. They have a lot of interviews with up-and-coming independent wrestling talent and also some very established independent wrestling talent, such as Anthony Henry, such as James Drake, or J.D. Drake, as he's called now, Brian Pillman Jr., and the legendary Rock and Roll Express. So go, definitely check them out. So we're going to get into the content here of this episode, and I have to put this disclaimer out there, and I'm sure that you guys definitely, I speak for all of us here. This is a very tragic scenario. This is a tragic situation. We're talking about two men who were both taken from us very early, being Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit. One of them was due to health complications, and we'll get into that, and the other one committed unspeakable, atrocious acts that we are unfortunately going to talk about here. However, as we talk about the career of Chris Benoit and the body of work of Chris Benoit, I think we're all fans of his body of work. So as Chris Jericho says in this episode, if you're going to think that we're, glorifying a murderer here, go ahead and turn this off, because what we're going to attempt to do here today is just kind of separate Chris Benoit's body of work from, his final actions, in his last days, which are atrocious acts. So no one is glorifying any of that here. But on the other hand, you do have the fact that Chris Benoit, in between the ropes, is one of the greatest superstars of all time. How do you guys feel about that?
So for me, it was always a thing that for a long time it was hard for me to separate kind of the two, the man in the ring and the man outside of the ring, because like we were discussing before we started rolling, I was a huge fan of Chris Benoit, and I always thought that his body of work was just so excellent, so crisp and intense. And so it did take me a while to kind of work things out in my own psyche to kind of separate the two. Whenever I refer to Chris Benoit in terms of his ring work, it's never an account to the last days of his life. It's always an account to the years and almost decades that he spent in the wrestling business. Never what happened outside of that.
Yeah, I think that the situation with him is just so complicated because and a lot of them say kind of the same thing on the documentary where it was just like, it's just such a weird position because it's like he never seemed like that type of person. He might have seemed like that in the ring, but that's the ring. They all said that like, he was like a little teddy bear, outside of the ring and stuff like that. Was he intense about things? Yeah, but you never saw that kind of thing, and then just just all of a sudden, it just seemed to come out of nowhere, like and stuff like that. But when you talk about Chris Benoit's work in the ring, man, I remember watching him as a kid when WCW was really really hot, the NWO and all that was going on. I remember I liked Benoit. I didn't realize why I liked him until I got older and stuff like that, and was in high school, and he was in the WWE and stuff like that. And then I realized, okay, now I realize why I like this guy, because just his intensity, the way that he would sell moves. I mean, like, he didn't just take bumps, like he took the full brunt of the bump and everything like that. He's amazing technical wrestler and stuff like that. But it's just so weird saying it, and I kind of feel like Dean Malenko, where it's like you can say he's one of the greatest workers of all time and then leave it at that. Just
Right.
just
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. And so what we're going to do in this first episode is kind of chronicle the setup that led to all this. So, the kind of major people involved in this, of course, is Chris Benoit, Nancy Benoit, aka Woman, and then also Eddie Guerrero. So we're going to kind of chronicle the three of them, and kind of everything that led up to these tragic circumstances. And in the next episode, we're going to go sort of into the details of those tragic circumstances, which is similar to the way that Dark Side of the Ring broke these down. Um, so in this episode, we started off with Chris Benoit's son, David Benoit, and kind of echoing your sentiment there, Caleb. He said something very similar. He said he would go out there and he was, in his mind, it was his hero. He was the greatest wrestler of all time, but then that was his job. And as soon as he got out of that ring, he was just dad to him. Um,
Right.
what do you guys feel about their choice to start the documentary off with David Benoit?
I'll go first, I guess, on that one. I mean, I think it was because like the way that they did it, he walked in to sit down for the interview and was like, let's rock. And like, to me, it was just kind of that moment where like you're watching this and you're like, oh, so this is going to be that kind of episode, kind of thing. All right, we're already getting ready for it. Um, and it's so heartbreaking because David, through all this, I feel like is very much a victim in all of this. Like a lot of people look at him the wrong way and stuff like that, which to do that is just absolutely asinine to me. I'm just like, he didn't do anything. I mean, he wasn't even there, and obviously he's not glorifying what his dad did, obviously, but we all have that moment where our fathers are our heroes, and that's the way it should be. There was nothing wrong with that. But to hear him say it, it was kind of like, oof, like, like it just, it already gave you that jab in the gut right there. It was just like, oof, I got more to
Yeah.
come,
Well,
like,
yeah, and he was, he was a lot of our heroes too. So I think that cut deep with a lot of us,
yeah.
from our generation, that he was our hero as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for me, it kind of seemed like it put things into perspective whenever I see or hear David speak on the matter, because I speak just from a fan perspective about how much I love Chris Benoit and how much it affected me. And then I look at him, who is a spitting image of his father, and I can only imagine the amount of pain and all the grief that he's had to bear and deal with over the past years. And so you can hear the pain in his voice whenever he speaks. You can see it in his eyes, and it's tragic.
Yeah, I agree. And sort of a interesting story. Like pro wrestling was something that me and my dad had in common a lot when I was a child. We didn't have cable where I was at, so he would drive me like 15 minutes up the road to my grandmother's house. She had cable, and I had to be in bed at 9:15, so I could catch like the first hour of Nitro, and that's it. And then I would have to go home and go to sleep. And we did that every Monday. And any of like the WCW, well, they was on VHS tapes back then that they had at like
Yeah,
at like movie gallery and stuff. We would rent those and we'd watch them together. And he was a
I
big
remember
Hulk
those
Hogan
times.
fan. Yeah, he was from that, the Hulkamania generation, so he was a big Hogan fan. And I liked Sting, and DDP, but the one wrestler we agreed on that we both loved was Chris Benoit. We were both huge fans of his work. I mean, how could you not be?
I remember a cool moment as a child because my dad worked for WGAC at the time, and WCW. They would come to Augusta a lot, and a lot of the times it would be Saturday night. Sometimes they did Nitro and stuff like that. But I went to a WCW Saturday night, and I just remember this. We were down on the floor and Chris Benoit was wrestling. I want to say it was Booker T. It wasn't like the best of five or the best of seven thing that they did, but I believe it was Booker T. And Booker T was the television champion at the time. And I was just like, man, I like Booker T, but I want Benoit to win the television champion. And then in this matchup, which was amazing from start to finish, I just remember like as a child, I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. But come on, Benoit, come on, Benoit. And then he hooked the crossface on him and Booker T tapped out. And that was one of the loudest reactions of the night was when he won it. And he was holding up the belt and stuff like that on the ropes. I was like, this is amazing, and like it was like those kind of moments as a child where I was like, this is why I love pro wrestling like so much and stuff like that, just because of those feelings. So I thought that was a cool little story and everything.
And Jericho is our narrator here, and this had to
You
have been
know,
pretty hard for him too. And Jericho talked about the fact that Benoit would give it 120% every single time
yeah,
he got in the ring. He tells a story about them being at a house show, and it wasn't televised. There's no camera to play to, and Jericho threw a spin kick, shadowed him. You know, didn't connect with it. Benoit takes the bump. Now we all know that this has happened millions of times over the
oh
years,
yeah,
um, and it that's just how it is. You take the bump and you hope that not very many people catch it. But Benoit was obsessed with his work ethic, and he went back in the back and made himself do 500 Hindu squats for botching the spot. Um, and that was just his work ethic. And so yeah, I mean, you talk about going to a house show. I think we've all been to a house show where you could tell that the guys are phoning it in. There was no phoning it in for Benoit.
nope,
Yeah, you're right. And it's like with house show matches, sometimes, like you said, you see guys who are maybe giving it an estimated 60 to 70% of what they do for TV. You see maybe slower paced matches of the exact same match. You saw the same two guys work on TV. You'll see a lot of that at house shows. And the fact that Benoit brought that same intensity and the fact that he took it so seriously to the point where he would put himself through something so rigorous as doing 500 Hindu squats for missing a wheel kick. I think that says a lot about his overall discipline and about his mindset on something. Like he was so, I would say, obsessed with wrestling to the point where something like that, where even a fan, whether it be casual or hardcore, wouldn't think twice about it. This man is a perfectionist, just dwelt on it, and he felt like he needed to almost atone for something that is very minuscule.
And well, we all know that Chris Benoit is a graduate of the Stu Hart, legendary Hart family dungeon, and that he started his career in Stampede Wrestling, where so many of the greats, came out of, including, Chris Jericho, who a lot of people today, would definitely put him in the discussion for greatest of all time. Um, do you guys think that Stu Hart played a large part in kind of instilling that work ethic into Chris Benoit?
Oh yes, definitely. Because you can tell that when Benoit talks about Stu Hart, or I mean, I guess in old interviews that he used to talk about Stu Hart, he would get very emotional and stuff about Stu. He loved, going to the dungeon and stuff like that and learning from him. But I don't think it was just Stu Hart. I believe it was his time in Japan that also had a lot to do with that, because in Japan, they were real strict back then. I don't know how it is in today's New Japan stuff going on, but I would say it was also his time in Japan. I would say it was a combination of both of where he got that type of discipline.
If you were trained by Stu Hart, that automatically meant that you had to ascertain a certain level of toughness, and that's something that most of his students had instilled in them, was this degree of toughness, of durability, and this mental mindset of this is how it's done. So I definitely think that that did play a huge part. But you can also tell, though, that I think that helped Benoit maybe take his intensity to the next level. But I think from the get go, his intensity was already so high that all that did was just add on to it.
I think he was just such a fan of pro wrestling that it just, the dungeon just was able to take his intensity to another level. But I think he was always going to be intense about it regardless, because he just was that big a fan of pro wrestling.
And Caleb, you mentioned New Japan Pro Wrestling. So in 1986, Benoit started doing these tours in New Japan, and he did tours with New Japan up through '94. And while he was over there, he met a man that we came to know as Eddie Guerrero. And this is another guy that everyone, I mean, you know, you, you talk about it at the time, the circumstances of Eddie passing were incredibly tragic for all of us because it came out of nowhere. He had this real life roller coaster of a story where, he had trained his ass off, and then, he got into drugs and alcohol and painkillers and all kinds of stuff really badly. Basically ruined his life, had to go back down to like the indie scene. If we had been around back then, we probably could have booked him, and just kind of had to, people tell stories about him coming to their indie promotions. And at the time back then, if you got one of the bigger stars on your indie show, it was kind of like he would come in and that big star would trounce all over your champion or whoever your local hometown hero was, and then they would leave. And that was kind of how it was. And Eddie was responsible for kind of bucking that trend and saying, no, I mean, I'm not going to be here in a month. Like this guy, why don't I put him over? And I don't remember which promotion it was, but the promoter was just like, jaw on the floor. I would have been the same way.
Ring
Um,
of Honor.
was it Ring of Honor?
Yes, there is a video of him in Amazing Red.
See, that's why you're here, because you watch more wrestling than anyone I know. And so yeah, I mean that's kind of the work ethic that Eddie had, and he went all the way back down and then worked his way all the way back up to the top. So he meets Eddie in New Japan, and these two kind of form, um, what is described by people close to it as, one of the most heartfelt, kind of close, just kind of genuine, innocent, like, friendships in wrestling history. So, let's talk a little bit about kind of Eddie Guerrero's origins. He's from legendary Guerrero family. And he came to New Japan originally in '93 um, under the he was like actually the second version of the gimmick Black Tiger. So, what do you
Mhm.
guys think about Eddie Guerrero? Can you recall the first time you ever saw him?
Yeah, I was actually always a WWF kid growing up, and I didn't actually watch very much WCW until much later on, and I went back and was able to watch a lot of the older stuff from WCW. But as far as coming up as a kid, I first saw him when he came in with Benoit and Malenko, and yeah, I saw those guys kind of wreak havoc on a lot of WWF guys at the time, and I was astounded. For one thing, as a whole, WCW guys kind of had a different type of I don't want to say mindset or work set, but they work differently than the WWF guys. And so that kind of opened my eyes in the first place of seeing how differently they worked from what I was used to seeing. But then just to see how fluid Eddie was, I was just blown away. Like, whoa, this guy is, like if wrestling was water, it would be Eddie. Like that's just how it looked to me. He was just that fluid whenever he worked.
What
Yeah,
about you, Caleb?
I remember seeing Eddie Guerrero in WCW for the first time because I was a WCW guy. It not that I didn't like the WWE as well. I kind of like both at the same time, but I just was always more of a fan of WCW. And I do remember seeing Eddie Guerrero. And I think one of the first times I actually saw him was wrestle Ric Flair.
Wow.
And it wasn't on pay-per-view. I want to say like it was on WCW Saturday night because I wasn't allowed to, stay up for nitros and pay-per-views and stuff like that as a child. So I had to watch like Saturday night, Sunday morning, Saturday morning stuff and everything like that. So WCW would always have, wrestling matches and stuff on Saturday mornings and Saturday nights. And Eddie Guerrero fought Ric Flair on it, and I was like, well, Ric Flair is clearly going to win this match, but it's Eddie Guerrero was really good. But when I really got familiar with Eddie Guerrero was when he turned heel in WCW, and he was just amazing as a heel. I mean, just amazing. And then the matches that he would have with Rey Mysterio, like that match at Halloween Havoc. Yes, that is truly one of the greatest matches of all time out of anybody. Um, it was so I remember that. I just remember, he just had like a different kind of swagger to him, basically. And then I would go and watch his old stuff and everything like that. So yeah, I was a fan of Eddie Guerrero. I never thought that in WCW he got his just due. He should have been bigger than a lot of people.
Well, that was the thing in WCW is that it was genius to bring in the cruiserweights, but they brought them in as filler, and they
Mhm.
became the reason to watch the show. And they talk about this in the episode too that we've got a scenario here where only these huge like heavyweights, you had to be 6'4" to be in the main event in WCW, and these guys didn't meet that criteria. And that's one of the things about Benoit, where they say that his kind of steroid abuse, kind of started there, was from him saying, okay, well, I can't make myself any taller, but I can make myself more and more muscular to look like these guys. And he did. I mean, he was incredibly ripped. He got to that point where he was as big as he was probably going to get. Uh, you know, um, my first time seeing Eddie also was in WCW because I was a WCW guy, and I mean, yeah, he had a different, just sort of aesthetic to him. He had a different style, even in WCW, and then when he came to WWF at the time, it became even more apparent because he stood
Yeah.
out in WCW, and now he stands out in WWF at the time. So
And his WWF run, like when he came back after being released from WWF or WWE rather, when his run as Latino Heat, that might have been one of the most genius things I've ever seen in wrestling.
Mhm.
I don't
right.
think that lie, cheat, steal gimmick that he did gets enough credit because when he was able to put that together, it was like, oh my God, a star is born right now. Like there's no stopping this now at this point. Like he was just so good with it. He would come out with a different low rider and stuff like that on every SmackDown. And I think one of my favorite moments of that was when Kurt Angle, screwed him out of the championship, and Angle was in a wheelchair for months, and it looked like he couldn't walk and stuff like that, which we all knew was BS and stuff like that. But they finally did the big reveal, and he goes around firing people, blah blah blah, and McMahon comes out, and he's just like, "Well, now hold on, now you don't run this place, I run this place," and he's they do their thing in the ring, and he's like, "You're gonna go one-on-one at SummerSlam, but you're gonna go one-on-one with Eddie Guerrero." And then Eddie comes down with the lowrider, and Vince is on the apron, and he's got Kurt's cane, and he's doing the Eddie. He's like, that is just good stuff. I don't care what anyone says. That is just great television right there.
Yeah, I mean, he was one of those people where, I'm sure that the Latino Heat thing, I'm sure that was a gimmick that was just like, hey, yeah, here, just do this. Like, creative just tossed it to him, like, and then Eddie made it worth $1 million. It was kind of that idea, like, oh, well, we'll give this guy something to do so he stays out of our hair, and then Eddie makes it a $1 million idea.
And Chavo doesn't get enough credit for that as well, because it started with them as the tag team.
Yeah,
and they were amazing as a tag team.
Yeah, Chavo was fantastic, and the thing about Eddie too, he was brought into WCW as a jobber to put over Terry Funk. They had a series of matches together, and you can go back and check those out. And I mean, he made Terry Funk look $1 million. Not that Terry Funk needed a lot of help doing that, but it was a situation where, once again, he's brought in as this kind of, just enhancement talent. And then he ends up making this, huge deal out of it.
I always thought that was kind of the spectacle of Eddie Guerrero. He was this rare anomaly that, like, every wrestling promotion always looks for, where you have this guy who's just an amazing in-ring talent, like his work is just almost flawless, and then you have the same guy who is also a charismatic guy who knows how to develop a great character, a great gimmick, and he knows how to utilize both together. That's, to me, always what Eddie Guerrero was. And so just to see him do that with the whole Latino Heat gimmick, to get that over the way he did, everyone loved it because it was great. He was great to watch, whether he was like working in the ring or on the mic. He was excellent.
So let's talk about the origins of kind of our third person here involved, which was Nancy Benoit. She came to be known. She was a woman, and before she was a woman, she was Kevin Sullivan's manager. And we did a previous episode about Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth, and in a lot of ways, kind of on the WCW and other kind of territories in the South side of things. She was very innovative in the idea of being a wrestling manager or being a valet, which is, as we know today, is pretty much a lost art. Especially on the national scene. If a female gets involved in the wrestling scene today, they have to be a worker, or maybe a ring announcer. But even if you become a ring announcer, it's probably from a scenario of you originally wanted to be a worker, and then something stopped you from doing that, and you end up being a ring announcer. So she was found by Kevin Sullivan in the late '80s. He was working for Jim Crockett Promotions, and then eventually Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And he kind of developed this sort of satanic type gimmick, and he brought her in as his valet to sort of be like his, I guess, kind of number one cult leader / girlfriend. And then they kind of had a real life romance together, and ended up getting married. And this kind of led them into WCW. They came into WCW together, and then the two of them were on a national stage. When's the first time that you guys can remember seeing a woman in any kind of angle or something like that?
I can answer that one. The first time I saw her was when they had, I guess, my generation's four horsemen in WCW when Nitro kind of first started, and they were all trying to take down Hulkamania and stuff like that. And Woman was with the Horsemen and stuff like that. And I remember Flair. Ric Flair being Ric Flair with her like we're gonna dance all night, we're gonna dance all like with her. And the thing though that I remember the most about Woman actually was when she would get like right on Mean Gene Oakland, right? Like he would be trying to conduct the interview and she would be rubbing her hands all over him and stuff like that, and he's just like he tried to swat her away and stuff like that. That's when I remember her. But then when like I really became familiar with her, and not necessarily the fallen angel part, but the one where I really became familiar with her was when she was in ECW the first time, because she wasn't managing Kevin Sullivan. She was actually managing the Sandman.
Yeah, that was in like 93, 94, something like that.
Yes. Yes, I had stumbled upon like some old footage of ECW, and she was like managing him at the time, and I was just like, "Oh, wow, okay, so this is different." Probably should not have been watching that at my age, but
Yeah, and so actually, all three of these individuals did a stint in ECW. Chris Benoit, Nancy Benoit, and then also, of course, Eddie Guerrero. Now, after this happens, we can kind of jump back into WCW, where Eddie and Chris both find themselves back in WCW, and Nancy kind of goes along with them. She worked a couple of programs. There's in the episode we see that excellent promo that she cut on Ric Flair. That was just gold. That was just kind of the stuff that you just can't write. Chris Benoit is introduced as part of the reformed Four Horsemen, along with Brian Pillman, as well as Arn Anderson and Ric Flair. And then you have Eddie, who goes back in, and he has a couple of U.S. title reigns. He had some awesome matches with Flair, with Conan. Of course, he sort of they did the whole LWO stint. He had a lot of awesome matches against members of the NWO. He had a lot of awesome matches there with Jericho.
Yes.
So I think WCW around this time, probably like 97, 98, 99 even, is where these guys were kind of getting, I think, more attention than probably anybody except for maybe Bill Goldberg coming out of WCW. I mean, the NWO had started to get old at that point. I think, this was the point where the NWO had gotten to where, 3 limos pulled up and like 97 guys got out, and that was the NWO. And there was like 3 or 4 different NWOs and all this other stuff. And so people were tired of keeping up with that. And then, Goldberg was on his, winning streak and everything. And then that after he lost the title, they really didn't know what to do with him. And so all the attention is kind of on these guys, and they never got their due. It was the same people in the main event. And so you have Malenko, you have Benoit, you have Eddie, you have as well Chavo, and then later, you had Jericho coming over as well. So you have all these guys that are the workhorses.
And Perry Saturn.
Yeah, Perry Saturn came over with the original 4. Because the original 4 that came over was Benoit, Malenko, Eddie, and Saturn.
Right.
And I thought it was odd that they like left Perry Saturn out of the episode. Like they didn't mention him at all.
That was very strange, actually.
Because he's in the clip. He's in the video clip.
Yeah.
You see him walk out to ringside.
Yeah. That was very bizarre. But
Yeah. There's a story there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they actually asked the creators I forget their names off the top of my head, but they asked the creators of that on the Dark Side of the Podcast, and they were just like, yeah, we didn't have time to really talk about him and stuff like that, and we weren't really focused on him, and but they said that they kind of regretted like leaving him out of it and everything like that, but they just didn't really have time to feature him.
Yeah. And them coming into WWF at the time, as we know, the head of talent relations at the time, the guy who has signed arguably all of the, if you were to sit here and make a top 20, this guy's probably signed 18 of them, was Jim Ross. And JR had his eye on Benoit since the 80s. I mean, of course, everybody, it didn't matter who you were watching Stampede Wrestling back then. It was kind of it was kind of almost like the New Japan of today, where it's like people all over the world. I mean, New Japan's definitely not like the biggest promotion in the world or anything, but people all over the place are watching it, and keeping up with who's coming up through the ranks there. And so, everybody was kind of keeping an eye on Stampede. Stu Hart had the, amazing reputation. Bret Hart had come out of there, and he was one of the major stars of the WWF. So, we've got all this kind of hype around these guys, and they're being misused in WCW. And Jim Ross brings in all four of them in one fell sweep. And they came in and they went up against what was left of DX at the time. I believe is the first group they feuded with. And
Yes.
And this was on the heels of the Monday Night Wars. The Monday Night Wars had started to kind of cool off at this point, but it was still going. So this was a big deal. What did you guys, Ace? We can get your idea on this first. Me and Caleb were both WCW guys, and so I know that from my perspective, I knew everything about these guys, and I was hyped to see them come on. What was your impression when these four guys that you may not be familiar with just kind of walked out onto Monday Night Raw?
So as a kid, especially, I just fell into a hook, line, and a sinker because, like you guys said, I really didn't have much of an idea as to who any of these guys were. Basically, the only WCW I'd watched was whenever I go over to like a cousin's house or whenever I was on vacation, I'd always, be able to watch like a Nitro or a Thunder that'd be on. But other than that, I was strictly WWF. And so when I see like the Radicals come in, first of all, like their first impression was, okay, so they made it blatantly clear these are WCW guys, and two, like these guys, they mean business, and they come in and first impressions are everything, especially in pro wrestling. And so they come in and they put the boots down, but we see them showcase what they can do, and almost immediately I see them and I'm like, I think I might end up liking these guys. I was always more into heels anyway, and so when they came in so hot. I was like, yeah, these guys may be it. And like I said earlier, because they worked a different style, they looked different than the atypical WWF guy at the time, and they just stood out in a good way. So I was all over it when they first came in.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and I kind of wish I'd been able to see that from that perspective. Caleb, what about you? Were you watching WWF yet at the time?
Yeah, I was watching WWF at the time because WCW's product was just absolutely horrible at that time. Even with those guys on WCW, it was terrible. No one was used right. Nothing made sense. You just didn't care. And WWE clearly had the better product. They had the better storylines going on. They just had better everything. And I do remember that episode of Raw when those guys walked out and stuff like that. I was like, holy crap! Like they're over here. And yeah, I knew all about them when they came. So I was very excited to have them. I was very excited to see what possible matches we could see out of it and stuff like that. I was very excited for that. The only thing I don't like, looking back at that Raw, I'm just like, why did they come in with all of this hype and they lost every single match that night?
All right.
Oh, you mean from like a business standpoint or from like a a storytelling standpoint, because one is definitely more easier to answer than the other.
Well, very true, especially with WWE, right?
Well, you have the Vince McMahon, the forever grudge against WCW. And we saw the kind of culmination of that with like Sting and the NWO doing the job for Triple H and DX. That was kind of like the final nail in the coffin of the Monday Night Wars of I won, I got your hero here, and we made him look like shit in front of millions of people.
Yeah,
and
like 20 years later.
Right, but I mean, this is Vince McMahon we're talking about here. This is a guy who is never going to settle a grudge. I mean, Kurt Angle is one of his own guys, and Kurt, just for spending a few years in TNA, I mean, you saw how Kurt Angle's retirement match went. It was despicable, but that's a whole other topic. We'll probably do a whole episode about Kurt Angle. But I definitely have a few quotes from Ace that I would love to share on that episode if we ever do it.
There are no quotes.
Okay, all right, we can table that. We'll table that. But anyway, it's just kind of that. It's that thing. It's Vince McMahon and his ongoing need to prove that kind of the WWF, like the metal of those competitors, that it's just a different breed than a WCW guy. And it took a long time for any of these guys to win him over. And I'm surprised that Jericho ever was able to get to the accolades that he reached. And I think Jericho smartly got out
with WWE.
Oh no, he'll be. I mean, you'll never hear him mentioned again. They're not gonna Benoit him and erase his entire legacy, but they're not gonna mention him. You're not gonna see him. You're not gonna see Chris Jericho probably in the Hall of Fame now. Unless AEW crumbles or something like that. But that's a whole other story we could get into.
Yeah.
But these guys, out of the four of them, Dean Malenko, who was one of the speakers on this documentary, and really described, Benoit as this quiet, like an incredibly focused guy, but a kind person. Malenko was one of the best. But due to injuries, he had to step out, and he spent several years, all the years since then, I think, as an agent backstage.
Right.
Still involved in the business to this day, and he's one of the all-time greats that doesn't get enough credit. But he kind of faded into the background. Perry Saturn faded into the background. He did the whole the moppy stint and all that. But the two of these guys that stood out and did eventually make it to the big stage were, of course, Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero. So this is where it's going to get difficult. So as we're building towards WrestleMania 20, right? So you've got Eddie and Kurt in their feud, and you have Benoit in his feud with he's tied up in the Triple H and Shawn Michaels thing. Second guy ever to enter the Rumble at number 1 and win, which that's one of the best Royal Rumbles of all time. I can't even recall how incredibly stoked I was.
Yes.
When that happened. So as we're going into that, which one of those feuds do you guys kind of pay more attention to?
I was almost more drawn to the Benoit story, just because I think we can probably all agree that Vince, he's always been more so about character-driven narratives. Whereas if you have this extravagant gimmick, if you have this over-the-top character, from a historic standpoint, it always seems like Vince is more likely to push you if you're over with the fans and you have this outstanding character gimmick. Whereas Benoit was never really that. Benoit, he always let his ring work speak for himself and define his character. And so to see Benoit begin to undeniably get over in such a manner, I was infatuated with that, because I never thought I would see a guy like Benoit get that kind of treatment, get that kind of push. And so to see him win the Rumble and to go on to Mania, like my mind was blown, and I couldn't be more invested into what he was doing.
And I believe the storyline at that time was that he had challenged Lesnar for the belt over on SmackDown
Mhm.
and had lost, and the stipulation was that he couldn't get another shot. And then he won the Rumble,
Right.
if I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah, Paul Heyman wanted to stop him basically, so that's why he put him number one. He's like, well, Chris, I'm gonna make you number one, but not the number one contender. No, you're gonna be the first guy in there and stuff like that. And he took the stipulation of it says you can main event WrestleMania, but it doesn't specify who that is. You can pick anyone to headline WrestleMania, so he chose the World Heavyweight Championship.
Right. And that was when Triple H was on a long stretch with the title.
Oh, God. It seemed like forever, didn't it?
It was forever.
It was.
Well, he did such a great job with it because, back then, I absolutely hated him. You admired his work, but, he did some of the best, heel work, with that legendary, last second kick out. Where he would just have you in the palm of his hand. You would 100% believe the babyface was going to go over and that he had won. And then at that 2 9/10 kick out, at the last second, it's amazing that he never botched one. Because that's something you're always terrified of it. With a quick kick out like that, it's like, oh man, what if I don't? What if I don't time this right? But he just had this long run, and for me, I can, that was kind of the biggest stretch for me that I can recall, like really being hyped for something. And then when Benoit showed up on Raw and went after him, this is probably the most that I ever was into any wrestling storyline ever, because it had been built up. Triple H, these incredibly long run, and all these people had gone against him. Kane, Booker T, Shawn himself, and nobody could take that belt from him. He'd been feuding with Shawn ever since Shawn returned. But instead, we've got exactly we've got Benoit going after, like, interjecting himself into this, and then Shawn is putting himself back into it, even though he didn't win the Rumble. He doesn't have the shot, and they're going to have this triple threat match. And I remember sitting there watching WrestleMania 20, which, if we look at that card, it's not really a huge card to write home about, other than the 2 title matches and the U.S. title match with Cena and Big Show, where Big Show kind of put Cena over, kind of on his way up. But
you weren't a fan of Goldberg and Lesnar?
No one was a fan of that.
Well, there was another match on there that I think doesn't get enough credit, which was Jericho and Christian.
Oh yeah, anytime that match ever happened, it was fantastic. Yeah. They had the Chavo was like the cruiserweight champion at the time, and he had had the title for a while, and he actually retained at that event. But I can remember watching it, and when Benoit won the title, I went outside and just screamed at the top of my lungs, because it was just this incredible feeling of, like, someone that you had watched your whole life that finally had grabbed that brass ring and was able to do it in this fashion. And then him and Eddie celebrating in the ring at the end. Chris Benoit's son David said in the episode, in the documentary, he said, "I wish they had just retired right after that." So I want to know what you guys think about that comment, and also how you felt about them winning the titles.
Well, I was going to say, though, as well, that, I did like Eddie Guerrero's story going into WrestleMania with Kurt Angle. Like that was really well done. And I loved him winning I think his victory wasn't as significant to me at WrestleMania as Benoit's was, because Eddie Guerrero had his the month before that when he defeated Lesnar, and that matchup was awesome. You could say whatever you want to about Lesnar, but Lesnar can put on good matches, and when you got someone with him and Eddie Guerrero, that was just great. But yeah, I remember seeing Benoit, like, literally the first thing I always remember from that moment is literally, he gets the tap out finally, and then he just rolls over, and he just immediately starts crying and stuff like that, and it's just so powerful. I was like, oh my God, like I love this right
Because
now.
it was real.
Yes, it was. It really was.
Yeah, this was the storybook ending. In my opinion, it's still my favorite ending to any WrestleMania. Like the closest thing I can think of would be 10 years later when Daniel Bryan won the title.
Yeah.
But like besides that, there's nothing that, in my opinion, can compare to the ending of WrestleMania 20. Seeing Eddie and Benoit in the ring, both champions, both celebrating, like that was perfect. And as far as Davis' comments about he wishes they both had retired then, I mean, looking back at something with a 2020 perspective, I can definitely understand why he would say that. And that would be the epitome of bowing out while you're on top, because they both were definitely on top in that moment. And to leave then in the moment of things, it doesn't make the most sense for me. But obviously, looking back, of course, you wish that.
And I think also too, you hear the comments by him, and obviously, what he said was very powerful and everything, and hit you right in the gut again. But I think the reason, a lot of the reasons why, you would say that is because once they both won their titles, look at what they had to do after that. I mean, the feud, first of all, I love the feud with Eddie Guerrero and JBL. I did. It was brilliant. But those chair shots, I mean, that chair shot at Judgment Day, I look at that and I go, oh my God, like, and then and their schedules got more rigorous and stuff like that. And since now they're thrown into the main event, now they're asked to really do just a bunch of stuff. So it's like look at all of what they had to do, and it's kind of like, well, you kind of see why you would wish they would just retire, because right there, it just some of those chair shots, man. Ugh.
Congratulations, you won the championship. Here, now you get to carry $1 billion company on your back. Don't screw it up.
Yes.
And I mean, there's a reason we both started nodding when you mentioned that chair shot. You didn't have to say Judgment Day. We already knew the one. It's in the documentary too. It's in the second episode. It's still hard for me to watch. That is, in my opinion, the most brutal chair shot that exists ever. And I don't know that it was intentional either.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like, I mean, you can't blame JBL for it because that was normal. I mean, that was just normal.
And it looked freaking amazing.
It did. I mean, it did.
I mean, for me to see it, knowing it's coming, that was in what, 2006? It was what?
2005.
I want to say 2004.
Late 2004.
Might have been 05.
Because WrestleMania 20 wasn't until was in 2004. So yeah, it probably would have been 2004. I mean, 16 years later, I mean, still watching it had the same impact on me I think it had then. So yeah, I mean that was absolutely crazy, that shot and their feud together and all the things that they were did. I mean, Benoit kind of went into this. He kind of didn't have the best title run ever. I don't think anybody could say that. I mean, his feud with Kane was pretty good, but they kind of, when they had him drop it, I believe he dropped it back to Triple H in a triple threat match.
No, he dropped it to Orton.
That's right. Dropped it to Orton, and then Orton dropped it back to Triple H. Right? Yeah. Memory's a little fuzzy on that one. I've been dropped on my head a few times since then too. So.
And two, another feud that was really going heavy on Raw at the time was still the Shawn Michaels Triple H thing. I mean, Bad Blood, Benoit didn't even headline as champion on that show. It was the Hell in a Cell match between Michaels and Triple H, which I know we can all agree was just flipping tremendous,
Yeah, they didn't know what to do with him. I don't know that they really knew what to do with Eddie either, but Eddie had that ability, as we talked about earlier, to take this tiny little angle and just make it, his own thing and make it good. So before we wrap up here, does anybody have anybody want to mention any like favorite matches between either featuring Eddie or Benoit, or any like kind of closing statements on the episode?
Well, I can name a few Eddie Guerrero and Benoit matches that I really like, such as the Lesnar match with Eddie Guerrero. Him finally winning the belt and everything. I loved going back and watching on Nitro. Now courtesy of the WWE Network. I loved watching some of their old matches, and there's one particular matchup. I believe it was like the debut of Chris Benoit, where him and Eddie Guerrero are fighting on Nitro, and he does a power bomb. And to this day, I have never seen a power bomb delivered with such impact than that one. Like, it even shook up Bischoff and Heenan. Like, Heenan was like, "Oh, like." They were not having to sell it. They were like, holy crap! Like, is he okay? Like, I think he killed him. But I think when Eddie won the title, right? I thought that he had much better feuds than Benoit did and stuff like that. Like, again, his feud with JBL. You can say whatever you want to about JBL, but that feud really put him on the map. And then, of course, Angle and Eddie, anytime those guys got together, anytime Angle got in the ring with anyone, it was amazing. Those matches. But again, I think a lot of my favorite matches come from the WCW days of Eddie Guerrero, because it was I loved that Halloween Havoc 97 match with Rey Mysterio. That match is incredible, and it still stands up to this day. But there was a couple too. That one that he had with Jericho at Fall Brawl. That one was really good. Just a number of things that he did. And I thought Eddie Guerrero, man, if he was still alive today, he would definitely be down at the Performance Center training people.
Yeah, or still in his prime.
Yeah, that's
still main eventing.
But yeah, just a bunch of other stuff. And then as far as Benoit, obviously his matches with Angle, pick one with the two of them. But one that I was going to mention, that a feud that not a lot of people talk about, but it was actually some really good stuff, was when they actually pushed Benoit as a main eventer against The Rock, when The Rock was champion, and they put Benoit with Shane. That was some really good stuff. And I love the old DVD. I remember the part where Benoit was talking about it, and he was like, at first it looked like I won the title. And he's like, I had about 50 text messages saying, yeah, that's awesome. You won. And then Foley comes out, reverses the decision. And then they texted him back, and they were like, oh, but sorry, never mind. You lost it or something. So that was good stuff. But I think the thing that, and I don't know if this is necessarily a good thing that he's remembered for this, but I think one of the things that Benoit's noted for a lot is his feud with Kevin Sullivan in WCW. That was like, really, like, as a child, I was like, whoa, why do these guys hate each other so much?
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing about Kevin Sullivan booking his own divorce is very real, and tragic in a lot of ways. And if there's anybody that I wish they could have gotten to be one of the speakers on this, it would have been him. But I can completely understand why he wouldn't have wanted to participate in it, due to some of the abuse allegations that are lodged at him that are probably accurate. But that's neither here nor there. Ace, what are your kind of final thoughts on this, and then any matches that you want to mention that stood out to you over the years?
Yeah. So one thing I do want to say definitely is that I thought that this first episode on the Benoit situation was really telling, and it was actually really, they didn't try to paint any certain narrative. They just laid it out as is and let you as the consumer take it in. And I think that those are always some of the great documentaries or docuseries, is when they just lay out the information and then let you come up to your own kind of conclusions as to how certain things are or how you should feel. But as far as Benoit goes, as like some of my favorite matches of his, like Caleb mentioned earlier, I'm such a huge fan of him and Angle. Specifically, I like their steel cage match, but I think their match at the I believe it was the '03 Rumble. Those two put on a clinic, and I mean, just hold for hold the entire thing. It almost leaves you breathless because they had so many excellently executed false finishes. But not just that, but the entire story of them both being such excellent grapplers and wrestlers. Like it was just an amazing match to watch. And also I also want to echo the match you mentioned about Eddie and Benoit back in '95. It was just an episode of Nitro. Yeah, that's when we saw that that amazing power bomb. But we also saw them both showcase just how excellent they were. And that was one of the things that, years ago made me wish that, man, I wish that I had watched WCW as a kid, because watching it, much later on, was, I appreciated it so much, but seeing it back then would have made it even better. Um, but yeah, also as far as Eddie goes, I think I'm starting to realize also I'm just a huge fan of Kurt Angle, but his feud with Angle was also amazing. And like anytime those two also stepped in the ring, I was just infatuated.
That's an interesting use of words that you have there regarding Kurt Angle. I'm jotting that down into my notebook of quotes. Um, no, there's only one match I really want to mention here because it's far out of left field, right? And this is Slamboree '98, Fit Finley versus Chris Benoit for the television title. And this was kind of this was the match that really made me realize just how tough Chris Benoit was, because these two went out there and they did this in WWE years later, but they were kind of both. I don't want to say Finley was in his prime, but he was, a lot more active and he was in a lot better shape than he was when he did his WWE run. But yeah, I mean, this was young, hungry Chris Benoit up against a guy who was a locker room veteran, and they beat the tar out of each other. And that, to me, other than the Judgment Day chair shot, there's a spot where there's a suicide dive out of the ring, and it's the interrupt with the chair shot. And I mean, that's probably the second hardest, craziest chair shot I've seen. And they just absolutely killed it. And that was kind of, I had seen Benoit before, but that was the match for me when I was a kid that really made me start paying attention to him more and more.
Yeah, there's one more Benoit moment that I have that I remember as a child too, and it's a WCW moment. But it was a Nitro where he had a steel cage match. I want to say it was against Jeff Jarrett. I think that's who it was. I can't remember exactly, but I remember that I didn't get to see the episode live as a child, but my dad told me about it. He told me, he's like, Benoit did this most amazing thing. Like, he came off of the cage and did the flying headbutt and everything like that. And people were talking about it. And I was just like, holy crap, I wish I could see that. Well, then WCW Saturday Night comes on and they replay it. And I'm upstairs and my dad just yells up. He just goes, Caleb, come down here. So I ran down and he's like, here it is. And you just see him just dive 15 feet off. And it was just, oh my God, like it was amazing. And I almost, look at that, now, and I'm kind of like, hey, maybe that wasn't the best idea, but it was so cool looking as a child.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was I think I remember that moment too, and it was just breathtaking and unbelievable. And he did that same move in WWF. I mean, every time. It's just like
Mhm.
angled in the moonsault off the cage.
Oh, yeah.
That never got old.
Mhm.
But that being said, we're gonna sort of wrap up this episode, and it's something that I think that fits this scenario perfectly and leads into our next episode is the famous Shakespeare quote: "These violent delights have violent ends." And that is, always been an incredibly powerful quote to me. It's used in Westworld, and it certainly applies here. So, as everyone who's watching this probably knows, this story does. Neither of these stories have a happy ending, um, and so that's what we're going to cover on our next episode. So you'll want to come back and join us next week for that. Um, Before we go, I want to thank our sponsor one more time. That's going to be Suplexes and Microphones, and you can check them out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, you name it. And they've got some fantastic interviews with some, indie and major talent all the way, top to bottom. Just some incredible interviews out there. If you want to get to know a little bit more about different wrestlers and kind of what they do in their spare time and their influences, things like that, check them out. That being said, our guest here today, Ace. Thank you for joining us. He's going to be back next week for part two. Ace, tell them where they can see and or hear you outside of here.
Absolutely, guys. So I like James mentioned earlier, I do also have a podcast called the Superhero Homies Podcast. And that is literally wherever you guys can find podcasts, whether it be Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, it doesn't matter. We're everywhere podcasts are. So if you want to hear cool comic book or superhero commentary, whether it be TVs, the books, or however, check us out there. We're also on YouTube as well. Just search for Superhero Homies. You guys can find us there as well. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and it's all Superhero Homies. So.
And one thing I do want to mention, not only is that podcast incredible and has a ton of like great content, movie reviews, comic book reviews, any of your superhero theme stuff, TV shows, movies, everything. They're also part of the Entertainment Evolved family, just like this program in Evolved Review. And so you can check out Entertainment Evolved on Facebook, and you can see a lot of the stuff that is being shared there. Go over to Superhero Homies on Facebook and give them a like and check out their stuff. Also, check them out on Patreon if you like what you see, and you can get even more stuff from them. And then also, I want to, as always, thank my co-host, Caleb Stoval. Caleb, tell them where they can hear you as well.
You can hear me on the Stoval Wrestling Network podcast, SWN, where we talk about what else? Pro wrestling. And we talk about the past, the present, and possibly future. And you can find that wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, Google Play Radio. We're on it. And I've got a good one coming up this week because this week we're going to discuss the four lowings going on in WWE and stuff like that. So you're not going to want to miss that because a lot of people have opinions about it. And come interact with us on Facebook at SWN, the Stoval Wrestling Network. And and we are part of TMB Studios. And that's where you can find me, and hope to hear from you on the SWN, the Stoval Wrestling Network.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap up this one. Make sure to come back for part two next week. I'm James Caleb Kitchens, and this has been an Evolved Review.